All right, we now have Professor Paul Mazerolle, who's going to present his presentation now to the audience and myself and Commissioner Wood. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to speak to you today about this topic of imprisonment and recidivism. My background, I'm the Pro-Vice Chancellor of Arts Education Law at Griffith University. I direct the Violence Research and Prevention Program, and I'm a criminologist by training and have been active in that area since almost 30 years. So what I'd like to begin by talking about some general comments to my submission, but also focus more specifically on the imprisonment impact on recidivism and the opportunities for reform going forward. I've got 7 points by way of general introduction. Firstly is in relation to the key causes and risk factors for offending. I think we need to start with the proposition that the causes and the risk factors for offending are multiple. They span individual, social, familial, educational, peer relationships, community context as well. And so we need to recognize that if we're talking about changing offending behavior, we need to understand how it's caused to begin with. When if we're talking about changing, whether it's through intervention or prevention, we need to understand the whole gamut. Secondly, is a recognition around the role of offender typologies and different pathways. There's increasing evidence that if you're talking about who becomes a young person on an offending trajectory, there's at least two dominant pathways in the evidence in the literature. Terry Moffat's work is the best work I've seen in the last 25 years that have clearly documented what are kind of more adolescent limited pathways of offending versus what are called life course persistent. They have different causes of their offending trajectories, and they require different kinds of interventions. So a one size fits all doesn't always respond to the underlying causes. Third issue, most people who offend avoid prison. I think we need to recognize that. If you look at the crime funnel, for only about 2 to 3% of offending generally across the community ends up in an institution. So if you're talking about changing behavior, changing what happens in prison can have an impact on recidivism and the crime rate, but it won't affect everything because most people who offend don't end up in prison. So I think we need to recognize that. However, most people who are in prison are the more serious offenders, and it makes sense to be targeting their criminogenic needs and risks because you can have a big impact on the crime rate, particularly if they're high-rate offenders. Fourthly, most people who offend eventually desist from offending, and that's been documented in the literature for quite some time, even though we can have a small subset of persistent offenders, usually about 6% of any birth cohort, up to 15 to 20% of a delinquency cohort, but most people actually desist over time. Even high-rate offenders can slow down over time, and those periods of desistance, even for the serious offenders, are seen through opportunities for marriage, into intimate relationships, connections to other people, social integration, access to education, job skills, and jobs. Those are some of the protective factors to the 20s and 30s, which redirect people's criminal offending. Recidivism rates are high. We know that. There's good evidence to demonstrate that. When I used to work at the CMC, we did a project called Project Aster, which was a Queensland-based study which demonstrated that, which looked at pathways from the juvenile justice system to the adult justice system. It was a very well done, very comprehensive study, but it showed that if you were a young, male, Indigenous person with a child protection involvement in the child protection system, you had about a 90% chance of being involved in the adult system. So there's very strong connections from juvenile justice system involvement and adult system involvement. So we know the recidivism rates are high, but that doesn't mean that we can't do something to redress that. The sixth general comment, before I keep moving on, is the importance of effective policy responses. There are opportunities to redress and to change the situation. It's not easy. There's not a lot of short-term fixes, but there are long-term approaches that have a battery of dimensions. Firstly, we need to avoid the quick fix common sense approaches, which I've spoke about previously, that kind of focus on what's called correctional quackery, the belief that there's easy solutions to the complex responses to crime. There's not. Secondly, there is a need to embrace evidence-informed approaches, not necessarily approaches that are entirely evidence-based, but things that have evidence backing them up, evidence-informed approaches. And thirdly, there's a need to understand the role of the individual, the familial context, the ecological context, and the institutional context. So if you're talking about policy responses to crime, well, we need to understand the individual risks, we need to know the familial risks, we need to know the ecological nesting. If they're leaving prison and going back home, well, what does home look like? Which neighborhood is it in? Do they have access to services? Are they surrounded by the criminogenic influences which led them to getting in trouble in the first place? And then what's the institutional context where the institution, be it employment institutions, familial institutions, access to services, etc. And number 7, by way of general introduction, is I think a recognition that there are multiple perspectives in understanding offending behavior. And also, by definition, there's multiple perspectives for thinking about how you reduce recidivism. So that's thinking about the individual risk factors, the social risk factors, situational dimensions which cause offending, and then the life course approach. I'm what's defined as a life course criminologist, so I look at what happens in the early years, the adolescent years, and the adult years. So that's all of a general background. The next heading of my submission is about what comes before prison matters. So before people end up in prison, whether it's a juvenile institution or if we target adult institutions, what happens before that occurs is very formative to why they end up in prison. I think that's obvious. So, and I've mentioned it before, the context around individual, familial, educational, employment, and peers, those contexts shape offending. So we know that many kids on this life course persistent pathway are born at risk. That is that and there's pretty good evidence from Moffat's work that shows that young kids who have low birth weight, who are born in families that are under stress and risk, they don't thrive as well in terms of their early childhood development. Hence the need for early childhood support for those families at risk. We know that those young kids on those pathways tend not to do well into preschool and school because they're not prepared, because they've had starting points which place them at risk. And so we know that they're at greater risk of truancy, dropout, and associated with antisocial peer groups. So there is that what happens before prison is really, really formative. Secondly, in relation to juvenile offending and juvenile justice involvement, we need to think seriously about what's called the dimensions of criminal careers: onset age, chronicity, persistence, versatility, high-risk offenders. So we know that the high-risk offenders are ones who start earlier, usually before age 13. There's documented evidence of that. So your early onsetting young people who are starting fires at 11 and 12, who are stealing stuff at 13, these are risk factors for a long career in offending, but also their opportunities for intervention. These people are most likely to be at risk for chronic offending, persistent offending, and what's called versatile offending. They're not just using drugs and stealing, they're also exhibiting violence and other forms of diverse offending behavior. And then that brings me to, again, just to reinforce the issues of these different typologies, but also to think about a term that's used in criminology called persistent heterogeneity and state dependence. And what that means is that there are some conceptualizations of why offending reoccurs, i.e. recidivism, because the issue of persistent individual differences or risks for offending. So if you're 14 and you have certain risks that make you more likely to offend, those risks might still be there in 5 years' time. And there might be very difficult risks to change. So whether it's personality or persistent poverty, they're persistent risks over time. And then there's the interpretation of what's called state dependence, and that says your offending leads to responses to create more opportunities for crime. So if your offending leads to you to be marginalized from school or not be able to get jobs, then the offending experience is actually leading to responses that perpetuate your risks for offending behavior in future. Both of those interpretations are relevant and can contribute to why recidivism occurs going forward. The third point I've already made, which is about major typologies, and I just want to reinforce that. We've got good evidence that there are different pathways, there are different risks. Some of them involve peers, a lot of them involve peers, but with the life course persistent, the peer involvement is incidental to the risks, whereas for adolescent limited offenders, the peer influences are formative to the risks. So they're different pathways. So peers matter for both, but on the former one, life course persistent offenders have the risks and they're drawing peers into their antisocial pathways. Number 4 is a theme around effective interventions. We know that there's good evidence that shows that early intervention can work. If you look at David Old's work out of Minnesota, the early nurse home visitation programs have had long-standing evidence on reducing violence and offending risks over, I think, 20 years. So targeting and working closely with women who are about to give birth, for instance, and giving them background information about effective parenting, nutrition, how to look after their own health to help their young unborn child. Parent training, Triple P. There's other parent training around the world. Out of New Zealand, David Ferguson's program, highly effective of giving parents the skills to deal with young kids who are presenting major challenges. And these challenges can be behavioral, they can be social. But having effective knowledge as a young parent to be an effective parent is really crucial. There's been evidence around the Perry Preschool program, which is 30 years running now out of America, which shows targeting kids at risk to prepare them for school is really formative. And I would suggest that Ross Hummel's work with the CREATE program that he's been working on, Pathways to Prevention, for the last 20 years, is also a really local evidence-based program that can target families at risk and kids at risk with the transition to school. The other thing I would say around interventions is about targeting high-risk juvenile offenders. If you're talking about people beyond the early intervention thinking, as someone who's already 14 and 15 and 16 and is heavily involved with offending and on a risk for a chronic offending pathway, there are things we can still do. And I think the best evidence we could point to is the MST work of Scott Henniger, the multiple systemic therapy approaches, which are focused on different ecological systems, familial, educational, economic, but it's a systems approach which has good evidence behind it. The second thing I would say around about effective interventions is that timing matters. So if you're talking about not thinking about early intervention, i.e. Dealing with children before school, and if we're not thinking about responding to 15-year-olds who have established offending repertoires, but if we're talking about 10 and 11 and 12-year-olds who are exhibiting seriously antisocial behavior, lighting fires, whatnot, there is a real opportunity to get early in the pathway before that escalates. Unfortunately, our juvenile justice system responses in Queensland, in Australia, in Western worlds generally, have a bit of a misguided approach to this. They think that interventions are going to lead to further labeling, and I think there's good evidence that that's not the case. I think there's pretty good evidence that if a young child at 11 or 12 is doing something antisocial, it's a proxy for I need help. There's institutional breakdown, and I need some kind of intervention. Not institutionalization, but maybe the family needs support. Maybe the young person needs some accountability. Maybe the young person needs some redirected social learning. But what we tend to do, and what the courts have shown over time, is that we just go light touch, light touch, light touch. And all of a sudden, 2 years later, that young child has said, well, this is a toothless tiger, I can get away. And they've learned to adapt. And they actually don't get messages of accountability for those 2 years where they've escalated in their risks. So I think that it's based on an understanding of labeling theory, which has been around for several years, and it's a really important theory. But what people don't realize is that those young people have already been labeled. They're already labeled as young people as antisocial, so they've already escalated to antisocial, what's called secondary deviance. My third theme is about what happens inside prison. Really matters. I know that's the main focus of this inquiry, but we need to understand what happens before as well. The first point I would like to make is around access to rehabilitative programs. Rehabilitation treatment can work. It's got a really important place in institutional context. So access to effective treatment is important, access to education is important, and access to picking up skills, because we know that post-incarceration, among the many risk factors, but access to a job is one of the big protective factors. Unfortunately, many of the people in prison have major educational deficits, skill deficits, and if they are released from prison and they don't have employment or deficits, or if they don't have skills to get jobs, their risk for reoffending goes through the roof. So on the issue of rehabilitation, and I know that in Queensland and indeed other parts of Australia, correctional authorities will be well familiar with the principles of effective intervention that have come out of Canada and North America in the last 30 years, the work of Paul Gendreau, Don Andrews, Jim Bonta, and others. that have brought in the risk-need responsivity principles you've probably heard about through this inquiry. I think the weight of the evidence is that that's still the best framework to embrace. With respect to the risk principle, target the high-risk offenders for the most therapeutic intervention that has evidence behind it, because if you target the high-risk offenders, you have the biggest impact on recidivism reduction. Secondly, need is, again, having programs which target criminogenic needs, so targeting things which lead to offending. And there's lots of good evidence of programs that don't work because they target things which aren't linked to criminogenic needs. Empathy is a good example. I mean, I've published on the importance of empathy before, but it's not a strong risk factor for offending, lack of empathy. It's more of an incidental risk factor. And so programs that target empathy don't tend to have any impact on recidivism reduction. The third principle is what's called responsivity, and that's actually tailoring treatment programs, rehabilitative programs, to the learning styles and needs of offenders. So some people might have different learning styles. They might have cognitive deficits. So actually having a cognitive-based treatment program that can be delivered to people that understand is really important. So it's not a dark art. There's real skill sets in developing treatment programs linked to principles. I think that really, really matters. The other issue, I'm just checking the time. I think I've got 3 or 4 more minutes.
You got time.
The second theme on rehabilitation I'd mention is in the last 25 years, there's been a push, particularly in America, less so in Canada, a little bit in Canada, to what's moving towards correctional program assessment audits. And there's a group out of Cincinnati, Ed Latessa, Chris Lowenkamp, Alex Holsinger, and others, who've worked with some of the leaders in rehabilitation over the last 30 years to develop audit frameworks, to go into prisons and say, let's look at your treatment programs and let's have a systematic audit of, do you have the right skill set staff? Do you have the right leadership? Is there correct implementation? And they actually audit correctional programs, and they can rate them on low, medium, high with respect to their efficacy in light of the principles of effective intervention. And what they find through studying the impact of the correctional program checklist approach is that programs which have high fidelity, that have good leadership, that are rated highly on the assessments, actually lead to recidivism reductions. So if the programs, it's not just about having an effective program, it's making sure you have the right leadership, the right resources, the right staff capability, etc. So there's good evidence that shows that assessments and audits of programs can identify programs that aren't working. Next issue I would quickly mention about prison, there's good evidence now that misconduct in prison is highly predictive of recidivism. So what actually happens in prison, in technical infractions, misconduct activity of people who are in prison, offenders in prison, is highly predictive of their future recidivism risk. So the point is that people who are heavily active of misconduct in prison is highly predictive of offending outside. And then the third and final theme under what happens in prison is about release decisions. Release decisions from prison are so important and formative for recidivism. I think it can't be overstated. The role of parole boards are really, really important. One of the problems that we've seen internationally with the move away from parole board discretion and the move toward mandatory release is that it leaves offenders in prison very little incentive to change. So if they know that they're going to serve longer time in prison under mandatory release, fine, but there's no incentive to change your behavior. So if you know that you're there for 10 years and you might get out after 9.5 versus getting out after 6, you would have a greater incentive to access treatment programs, deal with your issues of drug addiction, etc. So I think the role of parole boards is very, very important in terms of creating incentives for offenders to change, to sign up to effective programs. The other challenge with parole, I would say, and I've seen this in Queensland, and I'm certainly not an expert at it, but I've seen challenges with it, and I think it doesn't fit offender change behavior, is the idea of judicial imposed parole. That makes no therapeutic sense, in my view, that you would be opposing parole decisions at time of sentencing without giving a person at risk in prison an incentive to change, because they know when the release decision is going to happen. So I think that's probably a quirk in Queensland, maybe in other jurisdictions, which I see as majorly problematic. The fourth theme that I'd say is what happens in the community after prison is also incredibly formative. So there's really good evidence, and I submit to you some of the major reports done in the last few years around a study out of America called Returning Home, looking at the challenges of prisoner reentry. So it's about family, So people who return to a strong familial with supports, that's formative. Issues of employment. So access to work is a huge protective influence. And we know that folks in prison have educational deficits and employment skill deficits. So there's a chance to redress that. Thirdly is around clustering. So many people are returning to areas of disadvantage. So it's not only socioeconomic disadvantage, but it's also disadvantage in access to peers. So in socially disadvantaged neighborhoods where people are returning from prison, they're often returning to the same environments with the same peer groups, the same criminogenic risks. So how do we protect them from getting back in crime? It's very, very difficult. The fourth issue, I would say, is that success in the community for community corrections, turning around recidivism, etc., it is very much dependent on the interaction between the individual, the family, the community, the role of parole supervision, and employment prospects, as well as access to other services. So are they going to be accessing educational services, drug treatment services? How do you do that in a regional remote area? It's very, very challenging. So I've listed 6 areas for reform, and then I'll stop. I'm happy to take questions. First one I would argue is the parole release mechanisms. I would strongly suggest to maintain the role of parole board discretion and in fact reinforce that as an important lever for creating incentives and motivations for offenders to change and access effective treatment in prison. I think that's really can't be overstated. Secondly is a focus on the delivery of effective treatment programs in prison targeted to offenders with high risk levels. I know that probably happens, but sometimes there could be slippage. Which is not to say that people should be ignored in prison, but if you're talking about accessing the most effective, the most expensive, therapeutically cognitive behavioral change programs, you have to target the people at the greatest risk for recidivism. I think related to that is a commitment to assessing program effectiveness through established audit programs, such as the correctional program inventory or the checklist. I think would go a long way because it would allow an institution or a system to say, we have 40 programs, which ones are most effective? I think you need to do that through a systematic audit. Thirdly is a renewed commitment to the development of community correction programs which are effective. So we need to ask questions about what are the programs that we're delivering now, and are they really effective? How are they delivered? Who's delivering them? Do those folks who deliver them understand offender change models? Are they well versed in the therapeutic approaches to target criminogenic needs? Are effective treatment programs available in areas of need? Etc. Are programs assessed as effective? Meaning, are we evaluating these programs? If you take domestic violence, which is just one area, but it's so important, and I do work in this area. Right now, we tend to take a one-size-fits-all with respect to domestic violence perpetration, and there's good evidence that they don't work. The best evidence shows that Gondoff's approach is targeting a select group of offenders, but we know with domestic violence there's at least 3 different typologies. So that people might address some of the domestic violence risks, but they don't address the other risks, which leads them to recidivate. So fourthly is, I would argue, an enhanced focus on education and skill acquisition for offenders with a view toward educational employment pathways for incarcerated offenders. One of the biggest protective factors will be getting a job, having an intimate relationship where there's commitment and love, access to education. So if we can give people more access to education, better skills to get a job, and deal with some of their personality challenges which make relationships difficult, we would go a long way to insulating them from recidivism. You're effectively giving them more reasons to conform than reasons to offend. Fifthly is about staffing capability. They need to be boosted. Boost staff capability in effective interventions, risk assessment, offender change models, program evaluation. We need to have organizations where staff are committed to bibliotherapy. And what I mean by that is they're reading literature, reading what works, reading what effective treatment programs are. And so organizations need to have models where they can make this information available, not just to the people who work with the treatment program, but the frontline officers, that they become well versed in, wow, we can actually help this person, so we won't see him or her back again in 2 years' time. And lastly is really an enhanced commitment to research, innovation, and evaluation. So we talk about research. We talk about evaluation, but we don't do it as well on the ground. We create a lot of bureaucratic hurdles for developing research partnerships, whether they're in prison. 10 years ago, I led the Australian homicide study, which collected data on 302 people who have killed somebody across Australia, and Queensland was a major participant in that, and they were terrific. But across the country, you could see how difficult it was to actually do research in partnership with correctional systems and authorities because of the hurdles. So how do we actually minimize the risk, develop ways to leverage research expertise externally, but also boost up internally commitments to evaluation and working in partnership and trying to minimize the risks and focus on, well, what are we trying to do? We're trying to change lives. We're trying to change behavior. We're trying to change communities. So we've got to do that in partnership. Why don't I stop there, Commissioners? Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll kick off with the first question. The last point intrigued me greatly, partly because of the journey we've had in accessing data. It's not necessarily smooth.
It's terrible.
being blunt.
Yeah.
Your experience, no doubt, was similar.
It has been. Yeah.
What would work better? What would help?
I think, and I understand why data access can be difficult. In a previous life, I worked at the CCC as the research director, and we had certain levers at that organization to access public data. University researchers and non-university researchers have higher hurdles, and I think it goes to trust and it goes to risk mitigation. So I think what would help is if the institutions could develop a mechanism where they had some fellow travelers that they said, okay, you've got to go through this hurdle of signing up to be in the inner circle where we can trust you with this data and hold you accountable. I know that correctional authorities have been burnt in the past, and I've seen that happen where somebody accessed data, they publish a paper without coming back to the authorities and say, I'd like to publish this. They don't give them credit. And so, but there's ways to minimize that. So I think if you had a system that said, okay, if you want this, and this is what we'd like in return, we'd like to be part of what gets published and produced, we'd like to see a report back to the correctional authority, but if you can get in this inner circle, we trust you. So that could free it up and make it a bit easier.
Thank you.
Just around that, Paul, looking at what is collected, how it's collected, how could some of that also be better fed to policymakers? Because there's a bit of a disjuncture between those people who are crafting and making policy decisions, and those people also undertaking some of that research. So how could that relationship be improved, or what do you see some of the solutions there could be around informing practice?
Yes, I think it's a really good opportunity, and in some ways it's a really big question, because you think, how do you redevelop a system that says we can enable policymakers to access the right information in a timely way? Because one of the complaints from policymakers is, well, we give it the academics, we've got to wait 18 months because they're going to produce a 200-page report, they want to publish all the time. So we need a way that says, let's get some policymakers need a quick answer to this question. Does home detention work, or does community correction programs involving day reporting centers, are they effective? So I think the way to do it is to create some incentives. So if you look at, say, the Institute of Criminology in Canberra, they've had these short little 5-6 page reports. We used to do this at the CMC when I was there from 2002 to 2005. We would have 5-page reports that were focused on prevention pointers, or here's the issue, here's what we did, and here's the findings, and here's the implications. Don Weatherburn at Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research in New South Wales does that as well. He produces short reports which are methodologically rigorous, that have policy implications, and they're available on the web, easily accessible, but people need to know about it. So how do you actually get into the policymakers and the professionals to access that? So you need to do more than just produce the information. You need to have, let's have quarterly roundtables where people are accessing these, building this community of practice around effective treatment. So in trying to educate people that they have a role to play. So making that available. In Queensland, we're very fortunate. At Griffith, in Queensland generally, in Brisbane, we've got 3 fantastic criminology programs, UQ, QUT, Griffith. as a community in Australia, we've got the biggest concentration of people interested in crime and justice research. We're fortunate in Griffith we built what's called SAL, which is a social analytics lab, where we house administrative data. It's taken 2 or 3 years to do it. There's chances to actually, so we have a data hub of secure data that could be built on, and it's accessible to researchers around Queensland. And so trying to build on that to say, here's the police data, here's the corrections data, here's the health data, there's certain protocols to access it. And oh, by the way, if you do, it's not just about producing an academic paper, you got to produce a 5-page paper for policy relevance. So there's a suite of things we could do as a community to say, we want to access this data to help inform people to make better decisions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in the same way, perhaps could be those 5 pages documents could be generated too for community organisations about particular things, or NGOs.
Yeah, put it on the web as well, and then you can access
just
it.
following on from that, is there evidence available that you're aware of in terms of all the work that's happening that you do and are engaged with others in that contradicts what policymakers thinks works?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So
Tons, yeah.
things like. So where policymakers or perhaps...
domestic violence is the perfect example, and I'm very happy to put this on the record. I put it on the record before. The programs based on the Gondoff model have not shown to be effective. We see that all the time. And the reason is because it's not consistent with the evidence around the typologies of batterers. Amy Holdsmith-Monroe has done the best evidence, the best research internationally that shows that people who batter an intimate partner, male perpetrated intimate partner violence in particular, are one of 3 typologies. But the treatment program is targeting one type of typology. So it's not going to work. And there's been randomized controlled trials of court-mandated treatment programs which have shown they're not effective. But because this is our time of domestic violence, it is a major social problem. We want to redress it, but we don't have enough programs in the suite for governments to say, we'll have this and we'll have that. What we have is a one-size-fits-all approach. Yes, we need specialized courts. There's good evidence that they matter. But it's the treatment programs for turning around perpetrators of domestic violence. What we have available, and there's millions of dollars going into rolling them out, the evidence is demonstrable. They do not work. So what we need is a commitment to evaluate and develop some new programs that says, well, if somebody's going to bash their intimate partner or control, that they're committing intimate partner terrorism, they could be this person who also has versatile offending. So some batterers of domestic violence are also committing versatile offending. They're stealing, they're robbing, they're using drugs. Some of them have major mental and personality problems, and they're different than the stereotypical batterer, where the program is targeting the stereotypical batterer that's using power and control and has insecure attachment. So I guess my point is there's really good evidence that they don't work, but we're throwing millions of dollars at a program which is only going to work for maybe 20% of the people that engage in intimate partner violence.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Commissioner Wood. Yeah.
Well, the evidential base sounds quite strong.
Sorry?
The evidential base,
Yeah.
both internationally and in Australia, is quite strong, and I know your university has a large and deep database of material now.
Mm-hmm.
How engaged has your university or other academics been with governments of all persuasions to encourage them to take a more evidence-based approach?
Look, I think that's a really important question, and I've been in Queensland for 20 years, and I would say that there's been peaks and valleys with respect to the relationship between university-based researchers and government. And when I first moved here in 2000, I was at the University of Queensland, and I was really struck there was parallel universities going on. That university academics were doing their own thing, and government policy people were doing their own thing. I've been encouraged. We've had a couple of periods where it got a bit off track, but I've been very encouraged, and I've seen we've had strong partnerships at Griffith. I know UQ has very strong partnerships with the Queensland government, doing some very innovative research. The partnerships with the Queensland Police are very strong. Historically, we've been very strong with the Department of Communities and Juvenile Justice. If you look at Ross Hummel's work, Anna Stewart's work, Lorraine Mazerolle's work, I could list a dozen researchers who are doing really meaningful things. Where we probably come unstuck is the translation from research then to policy and practice on the ground, and to thinking. And I do recognise that the Commission, where I used to work years ago, had a very formative role at criminal justice policy innovation. You know, we did some great work back then on high-speed pursuits. We did work on police beats. I know the Commission still probably does that, but you don't see it as much in terms of driving crime and justice policy reform and innovation. So maybe it's happening behind the scenes, but in terms of that upfront evaluations of what works in policing domestic violence, responding to serious and organised crime, what are the innovative models, there's still great opportunities and gaps.
Okay. Yeah. Our terms of reference requires us to consider Indigenous communities as well, and we've done a body of work on that recently.
Okay.
How applicable is the research that you cite in terms of remote and discrete Indigenous communities here in Queensland?
Highly relevant. So all of those issues of risk need responsivity, for instance, are highly relevant for Indigenous offenders. Issues of timing of interventions, highly relevant. And in fact, one of our great failings is, I think, and I've seen this when I've done work in juvenile justice in Queensland, work with the department, is those missed opportunities for interventions with 10-year-olds and 11-year-olds because we think too much system involvement will lead to bad outcomes. Well, then we're ignoring opportunities to redress criminogenic risks that will escalate over time. So all of this is highly relevant for Indigenous. In fact, I would say it's actually more crucial to have evidence-informed approaches. And these kinds of approaches, you know, they work in New Zealand, they're applied for Maori populations, First Nation populations in Canada and the States. So they can absolutely transcend to populations that have even more risks. So for me, that almost reinforces the need to be even more systematic and more targeted and more motivated because the risks are so high for those communities.
That's a really encouraging response. Thank you.
Yeah.
Commissioner Frederick, I have a final question.
Great.
You mentioned the time is right for domestic violence discussions. It is right.
Yeah.
You mentioned the 3 different typologies. That sounds like a very persuasive case for reopening domestic violence programs and re-examining them.
Does, yeah.
And, you know, it is the right time. Is there an impediment for that happening? Is there fertile ground for pursuing that?
Well, I think so. I mean, and I would like to hope so. The discussions I've had with senior members of government have been encouraged to say we're looking for some new models. There is a very strong voice, and I know there's different voices in the domestic violence community, and I'm one of them because I'm really committed to domestic violence research and prevention. But I know there's very strong voices that this is the only way to proceed because it's all about power, or, you know, the Gondoff model. And I think that's part of it, but it is much more because people that exhibit violence have other risk factors as to why. It's not just about power. It's not just about insecure attachment and jealousy. It can be because some people are really antisocial. They're bashing their intimate partners. They're bashing their friends on Friday night when they're drunk. You know, so they're antisocial people. They're committing different types of crime. And then there's other people who have this deep-seated psychological and mental health issues which need to be addressed as well. So if we can have a spirit of let's explore different options, let's trial some new things, and let's see what happens. But I mean, I have staff who work and colleagues who work in the NGO sector and said, I'm implementing this program, but I actually know it doesn't work. So I'm really disillusioned. And I can see it's not working to this group of domestic violence offenders. So there's more we can do.
We've got time for 1 or 2 comments. Yes. Please remember to say your name and where you're from.
Hi, my name's Dr. Michelle Denton. My area of research has been in qualitative on the transition experience of mentally ill prisoners. I interviewed prisoners inside and then followed them out into the community and to see what happened to them, and did in-depth studies of some of the first work that's been done in Australia, specifically around mentally ill prisoners with co-occurring substance use and their transition experience.
Yes.
I agree with, you know, most of what you say, but I'd like to, and I'll be speaking later on this afternoon, but I'd just like to make a quick link between some of the things that you're saying and some of the things that Karen Walsh said earlier. So from my research and also from the international literature, the young men that I interviewed had almost all of them had worked in prison, in the furniture shop, in the kitchen, as cleaners, whole range of activities that they'd taken a lot of pride in working in prison. And so clearly capable of working, and also they'd done certificates and training and literacy and all of these good things, and they'd done treatment programs. They come out of prison and there's no supported employment. They were all unemployed. There was no hope really of them getting a job, because
nobody would hire them. Is that the issue?
No one would hire them.
That's right.
And so, I'm also on the parole board, and I'm seeing a lot of cases where men are coming out of prison who have been involved in domestic violence. And, that's obviously very complex, and all of the things that you've been saying about that. But those men, they may have done programs, and they may well have had a change of attitude, and what they're going into is often because they don't have anywhere to live and they don't have any supported accommodation. They're going into hostels, very impoverished environments where there's no support, there's no ongoing support. So again, the way that the community's resourced to support people when they come out, no matter whether they've had all the bells and whistles in prison, doesn't make any difference if you're going into a very impoverished environment where you've got unstable accommodation, where you don't have emotional support, where you're lonely, where you're using substances.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, that's that whole community context. So you're returning to areas of risk, not accessing support, no good services. Where's your familial support? Where's your chance for a job and a chance for a bright future? We've got to get that part of the puzzle right if we're going to reduce recidivism.
My concern is that in my interactions with corrections, who I know are doing the best job that they possibly think that they can, is that, and also in much of the criminology literature, the emphasis is on the individual responsibility, on what happens inside prison, and there's very little attention or understanding about the broader social context that people are coming out into.
I think there is an emerging literature on that. If you read Todd Clear's work out of the States and Bruce Western, who's originally from Queensland.
I'm going to draw it to a close there. We don't have time for another comment or for a full response, Paul, from you.
Okay.
We do have someone who's Skyping in for the next presentation, so we're really keeping to that schedule. Are you hanging around? Sorry to put you on the spot, but are you going to be around a bit later, or you've got some other appointments?
I'd love to hang around, maybe for 15 minutes, but I've got a flight to Canada.
So if anyone does have anything burning they want to add, please talk with Paul up the back or just outside. But we need to move into the next presentation.
Thank you, Paul. Much appreciated.
Thank you very much.
And I'm sure if anyone wants to make a comment, they can find Paul at the at Griffith University.
Absolutely, yeah. At least for another
through the
6
website.
weeks.
Thank you. Thank you.